Hello, and welcome to my Warhammer Ghost Story for Christmas. Every year around this time, I like to share a little bit of unofficial Warhammer fanfiction that I've written. This year, though, I came across something whilst researching a video in an old copy of the Monstrous Arcanum, a sheaf of papers that contain a story that I'm going to read for you today. It's a tale called The White Goat. Are you sitting uncomfortably? Then I shall begin. The forest road was dark at night, unfathomably dark. The green glow of Moor sleep failed to penetrate the thick canopy above. Heinrich Gillum had a nervous disposition at the best of times, but surrounded by the pitch-black tree line and the inexplicable sounds emanating from beyond it, he was practically apoplectic. His riding companions were more used to riding at night, more seasoned and experienced, and they showed little of the apprehension that gripped the young man. The massive soldier Brankov looked at the small sheepish Gillum and chuckled to himself. "You're not one of us, Gillum. You cower at shadows and scream when scratched by a branch. I cannot imagine you stealing hay from an open barn, so timid you are. How did you even end up here?" he asked, before looking to their silent riding companions for agreement. Gillum replied, "Just unlucky, I suppose," before sidling his horse away from Brankov and towards the other two riders. Simmery noticed the move but made no comment, nor did she acknowledge Brankov's knowing look. She had no interest in making friends tonight, or enemies. She just wanted it to be over so that she could be making her way back home as soon as possible. Her family farm in the Grandschalt Valley was not much to look at, but it was away from prying eyes and Imperial soldiery. It felt safe there, and she did not have to justify actions to anyone but herself. At the farm, there were no problems that hard work and a good shovel couldn't fix. She regretted leaving. Simmery's thoughts were interrupted by the shrill voice of the fourth rider amongst their number, Fuzel de Ruinart. The young man claimed to be a wizard, unfairly expelled from the colleges in Altdorf. A simple misunderstanding, he'd said, but Simmery hadn't seen him so much as click a finger, let alone cast a spell. She suspected that the handsome braggart had made a living convincing people that he was something more than he really was. He also claimed to hail from a rich family of Bretonnian royalty, and to have once killed a walking, talking man-rat in the city sewers. The fool made a lot of fanciful claims. "How long until dawn?" said the fussy Bretonnian mage. "It feels like it has been night for days." "Surely you can sense such a thing, mage," replied Simmery, the exasperation in her voice left unvarnished. "Though I will grant you that it has been a long night," she continued. "Feels like we could have ridden as far as Kislev already." "No," said Brankov, taking Simmery far too seriously. "I fought in Kislev for many days. It does not have forests like this." With a derisive snort, Gillum sniped, "But we can't even see this forest. How can you know what it's like?" There was a moment of silent tension as Brankov stared bloody daggers at the slight, shivering form of Gillum. "Just because we cannot see does not mean we cannot know. There is the scent of the sycamore and the black alder, trees that do not grow beyond the far borders of Osterland. Look to the stars, and you can see the constellations, Dragomas and Mammoth, as they are from the Empire. Listen to the sounds of the rustling of the bushes and the holly fern. All of this tells anyone but the blind and deaf that they are in the great forest. It is as plain as day where we are, just as the snapping twigs and padding paw-falls makes it plain that a pack of wolves has been trailing us for the past hour." Gillum was stunned into silence by these observations, pulling the blue Osterland wool cloak tighter around his shoulders as he glanced again into the darkness. "Wolves?" Tramping a little further along the road in silence, the riders seemed lost in their own thoughts, though each kept at least one eye on the darkness that flanked them. With Fuzel and Gillum silently riding just a little ahead, Simmery leaned towards the great warrior Brankov and asked, "You fought in Kislev?" "I did," he answered. but it is best not spoken of. The assaults of chaos are not to be dwelt upon, lest they threaten your mind as well as your body." Simmery looked at Brankov with a doubtful expression, prompting him to continue. "You wish for heroic war stories, something to give you warmth and hope on this cold, dark night. I can only disappoint you, friend. With chaos, there is no warmth, there is no hope. It will come for us all." "I know something of the ruinous powers myself," returned Simmery, her face ashen and serious. "You are right. It will come for the Empire one day." "You misunderstand me, friend. Chaos has claimed us four, and it will come for us, ere long." At that, Simmery and Brankov descended into the same sullen silence that their companions had been in for some time. "I think I've spent some time near here," Fussell told Gillum as they scoured the tree line for evidence of their location or their pursuers. "The town of Gelderhof can't be far away, and there are many logging camps that surround it. We mustn't be far from civilization now." Gillum seemed visibly relieved at this pronouncement, so much so that Fussell couldn't help but notice the brightening of the young man's face, an outcome that the cantankerous mage felt compelled to reverse. Fussell went on. "Yes, that's right. If memory serves me, and by Sigmar it always does, there's a coaching inn not too far down the road, and then a league beyond it lies a tiny hamlet. Hofferlin, I think it's called. Have you ever been there, young Gillum?" Some colour had returned to Gillum's face, and he responded with a shake of the head. Then you've likely never heard the tale of the White Goat. The people of Hofferlin have been telling the story for generations. Some say it's merely to scare the children, others that it speaks the truth. Every year, around this time, 4 people go missing, dragged off into the woods during the night by an unfathomable evil. A spirit of the woods that haunts and hates the people who disturb its peace. Not one of the victims has ever been found, not even their bodies. And whatever took them remains unknown. A woodcutter on the path once claimed that they saw a ghostly figure of pure white sloping through the woods the night of a disappearance. But though he chased it for many hours, he never caught up. The wise woman of the hamlet, before she was cast aside for poisoning her lover, claimed that dark forces resided in the woods nearby. But then again, most folks think she summoned whatever's out there, so who's to say what happened to those 4 lonely travellers? As Gillum's face adopted again a pallid hue, his shivering intensified. From beyond the pair, Brankov broke into enormous peals of laughter. "Come now, boy. You need not be afraid of a goat when you ride with 3 dangerous fighters like us. Don't be a halfling's napkin." "Not everything must be a chance for you to insult the boy, Brankov. Can't you see he's terrified?" said Simmery. "I'm not scared," stuttered Gillum. "It's just cold. And I think I saw something covered in white fur in the forest. Maybe the white goat is what follows us." "The only thing following us will be a unit of von Rorkov's knights," dismissed Simmery. "And a pack of wolves," added Brankov. "And a pack of wolves," amended Simmery. "And the white goat," Fussell said with a smirk. The other riders looked at the self-professed mage. Simmery rolled her eyes. Brankov chuckled. Gillum shuddered. In the darkness of the trees, a shadow moved. What felt like much later, the 4 horsemen still seemed to have made little progress. They had not yet come upon the inn that Fussell claimed was just up ahead every few minutes. Eventually, Gillum looked at the others and asked how far it was to Hergig. Brankov was the first to answer, though not before uttering an unnecessarily loud scoff. "We're still many days' ride from there, Bubchin," said the warrior. "We left Dragberger's fortress less than a day ago. Even making great haste, we'd be many days from Hergig. And we are not making great haste. Perhaps we were all affected by the crash more than we thought." Simmery had not been paying attention to her companions. Instead, she had become distracted by the blood that stained the sleeves of the uniform she wore. She didn't know how it had gotten there. The ear-piercing voice of Fussell cut through her thoughts, almost giving her an instant headache. "Perhaps we should ride into the forest itself. Leave the road entirely. That would make us harder to track. And easier to eat, you fool, Simmery shot back, her frustration on full display. Your goat and Brankoff's wolves are all out there, remember? I'd rather face phantom livestock than a cavalcade of angry horsemen, to be honest, said Fussell. I'd rather fight the knights, muttered Brankoff. Oh, very good. Let's all prove how big and strong we are, shall we? Said Simmery. Who has the best reason for being here in the first place, eh? Who's the most dangerous of the lot? That'll show everyone how tough we are. The 4 riders, dressed in muddy, bloody black and white uniforms of Ostland state troops, came to a halt as they turned on each other, frustration finally boiling over into outright hostility. They argued points of meaningless detail about their journey so far, cast recriminations at one another for holding them back or leading them down the wrong path. Each was angry at each other, at the situation, at the world for leading them to this nightmarish moment. Lost in the woods with a group of strangers with just one thing in common. They were all criminals. From the trees, it watched them. Their bickering had been amusing, but this new squabble was even more delightful. Stewing the meat in passion and rage only made it more delicious. It would not be long now. It had only been half a day earlier or so that Gillum, Brankoff, Simmery, and de Ruinart had shared a wagon. Manacled, chained, and dressed in the rotten rags of prisoners, the 4 were unhappy guests of the von Rokoffs, placed inside the sealed cart for transport to Wolfenburg, and accompanied by several state troops. When they arrived in the city, they would face justice for their crimes. None of them spoke, or even acknowledged their newfound travelling companions. So consumed by their own thoughts were they. Each knew that they would face certain death for their crimes. The impending visit to the magistrate, a mere formality. Lord Drakberger simply wanted the blood to fall on others' hands, so he was palming them off to von Rokoff. Simmery could not believe that she had found herself in this situation. She had fled her home to get away from a life that felt restrictive, a home that felt like a jail. She wanted to make her own way in the world, become a great adventurer, not waste her best years labouring over barren earth and failing crops. Not that things had worked out that way. Stealing food so you don't die of starvation, stealing coins so you can afford shelter, stealing ale so you can feel something. It was all just a different kind of prison, and now she was on her way to another one. Several hours into their journey, just as night was falling and the wagon was nearing the coaching inn, it came to a sudden, unexpected halt. Inside, the 4 prisoners were launched from their seats and smashed against the walls of the cabin with such force that it was a miracle they weren't more severely injured. The wagon must somehow have crashed into a tree. It had flipped onto its side, and its walls had broken apart, throwing all 4 prisoners clear. When Simmery had come to, it was already getting dark, and she had been freed from her chains. Brankoff, the brute, had awakened first and taken their manacles apart with a couple of enormous rocks. The other 2 prisoners were still unconscious, but Brankoff was in the process of hammering their chains too. Simmery rose gingerly, careful not to attract anyone's attention. She couldn't see any of the other guards who had been escorting the wagon, but they mustn't be far. There's no way they would walk away from 4 prisoners. As she straightened up to get a look around, she felt a sudden sharp pain in her chest. She must have bruised a rib in the accident. It was so intense that Simmery took a sharp intake of breath. Mercifully, it was brief, and she was quickly able to move again, though the lumbering oaf had been alerted to her wakefulness. She wasn't sure why he'd unchained her or the others, but if he wanted a fight, she'd give him one. As he turned to look at her, she reached down to the floor where a bloodied sword lay discarded in the vines and undergrowth. Easy now. I'm Brankoff. I'm not your enemy, said the big man, and then he gestured with his chin to the forest around them. That's your enemy. And mine. And theirs, he said, pointing at the other 2 prisoners. Only together we'll make it out of here. Simmery knew he was right, But that didn't stop her being suspicious of him. They were all prisoners, which meant they were all criminals, and this orcish hulk could have committed any crime. Still, she knew that if she was going to survive a forest, and evade the patrol of knights that would surely soon be chasing them, then she would need to make fast allies. And he had freed her. She lowered the sword and said, "I'm Simmery. Did you kill the guards?" Brankoff laughed in surprise. "And do what with their bodies? Eat them whole?" Simmery realized he was right. There was no sign of any of the guards at all, nor even the coachman who had been riding their prison wagon. Then, she noticed the blood. There was a small pool of scarlet liquid off to one side of the road. Brankoff, having finished unchaining their fellows, noticed what she was looking at, and slowly rose to join her, picking up an aggressive hunk of wood from the wreckage as he did so. Together, they approached the pool cautiously, watching the trees and listening for any sound of ambush. It was definitely blood, and it was a lot of it. The ground around the pool was torn up and tramped down, as if there had been a great deal of movement. There had been a battle here. Simmery was certain of it. Broken branches, foot and hoof prints told her that things had moved into the forest itself. With the sun falling fast and darkness already becoming oppressive, it felt foolish to follow the bloody path into the trees. But Brankoff was already stepping forward. He was probably right again. If any of the guards still lived, then they would be a problem. And if something had killed them already, then, well, that was an even bigger problem. It was not far before they found the horses, tied off to some low branches. The forest was quickly becoming thicker, harder to traverse on horseback, but it seemed strange that they would even bring them this deep. Quietly, Simmery asked Brankoff, "Why not just leave them by the wagon, walk in?" To which he replied, "They'll never be able to tell us why." Though crouched down, he was still huge, and it felt like an eternity as Simmery followed his outstretched arm and slowly looked to where he was pointing. On the forest floor, in a small clearing just ahead, lay 4 dead soldiers. The bodies were arranged as if in points of the compass, their heads together in the center, and their legs pointing out in the cardinal directions. Stranger still, their arms were folded across their bodies, giving the impression that each lay in a final repose, as if ready to be sealed in a dungeon tomb or barrow. Simmery had seen many stone tombs carved in much the same way, and had relieved them of the treasures that they concealed. Brankoff stayed stock still for what felt like the longest time, observing the forest around the bodies, looking for signs of whatever had done this. He spoke only once whilst they waited, as much to himself as to Simmery, muttering under his breath, "This is not natural." Eventually, confident that whoever or whatever was responsible had moved on and was no longer a threat, the 2 prisoners moved in for a closer look. The soldiers looked oddly peaceful, despite the vivid red that stained much of their clothing. Their eyes had been closed, and their expressions seemed as if they were merely asleep. Simmery recognized them all as the guards who had been escorting their wagon. Each had been present when they were sealed in, though there was no sign of the driver. "We should not tarry. I do not trust these woods," Brankoff said, visibly shaken by the scene. Simmery replied, "I agree, though before we go, we should take their clothes." Brankoff's eyes pierced the deep black of the forest, casting about for signs of life in the trees. He knew for certain that something was watching them, and had been since they stole the dead soldiers' trappings and took their horses. It seemed unlikely to be the driver. Assuming he had even survived, he most certainly would have returned to his lord with news of the crash. Nor did the stout warrior think it could be Fusel's phantom villain, the stuff of bedtime stories for children. No wonder the Booch and Gillum was so frightened. It did not do to fear one's own shadow. From the darkness, there came looming a jagged stack of shapes on the edge of the road. They had arrived at the inn. The mage had described it as a coaching inn, but that seemed far too grand a title. It was little more than a ramshackle collection of timbers, bound together almost at random to create a large rattletrap building, much of it covered in vines and moss. Enclosed by trees on 3 sides, there was a main entrance to the inn itself, and a small sheltered area on the side to tie horses and park carriages. A small barn stood a little way off from the shelter, its doors tied closed. The 4 riders came to a stop shortly before the inn, and looked to one another for a decision on how best to approach it. If it weren't for the blood on their clothes, they could have simply taken a room without issue. But now, they would surely have to explain away the stains that covered them. Confidence would be key. It was completely legitimate for a soldier to become thusly tarnished in the pursuit of their duties. All that was required was a simple acknowledgement that there had been a fight on the road. A tale of highwaymen would suffice. Fussell shared a thought, however, that could add a complication to the ruse. What if the tavern was expecting the wagon? A pre-arranged holdover for a regular journey to Wolfenberg? Simmery had to admit it was a possibility. It seemed to all involved that she would be best placed to speak with the innkeeper on behalf of the party, so she would need to account for their lack of a carriage. Perhaps the truth could work in their favour. A crash, an escape, a need to sleep before continuing the chase. Throughout this discussion, Brankoff remained oddly silent, concentrating on the inn itself. Simmery was not surprised that Gillum would want her to do the talking. He seemed altogether too cowardly to speak even to his fellow prisoners, let alone a stranger in a position of authority. She still couldn't imagine what the small man had done that would have him in the same prison wagon as people like Brankoff and herself. Fussell was also happy for her to speak for them. He was a charmer and a natural talker, even though he was irritating, but he also seemed to want to avoid any responsibility or pressure. It was always easier to stay relaxed and unbothered when you don't take anything too seriously, or have to do anything serious. Brankoff, though. Simmery was surprised at his agreement to her taking the lead. The big soldier had no lack of confidence or fear of failure, and he clearly had strong opinions on how things should be done. But instead of arguing for the lead, he had simply stared at the inn and exhaled in agreement. She was about to ride forward again, when finally Brankoff broke his silence. I guess he did have a problem, she thought. There's no one in that inn, he said. What do you mean? Replied Simmery. The lights are out because it's the middle of the night, Brankoff. Everyone will be asleep, said Fussell. It's not the lights. See, the door is ajar, not closed and bolted as surely ought to be. The upper window is open, another is smashed, and no curtains are drawn. Not even a hint of smoke rises from the chimney, nor a flicker of candlelight is cast out. The most telling of all, it's too quiet. The brute is right, thought Simmery. It was almost silent here. The inn and the forest made no noise at all. Only the riders and their 4 mounts broke the quietude. Okay, said Simmery. Something does feel wrong. I say we still check it out. If the place has been abandoned, then we can still get some rest before sunrise and get away early, before anyone can catch up with us. The horses need a rest at the very least. And I don't know about you lot, but I could do with something to eat. That was all it took for Fussell to heartily agree with Simmery's plan, and Gillum was as amenable as ever. Even Brankoff acquiesced. Together, they dismounted and approached the darkened inn. It did not take long to confirm Brankoff's suspicion. The inn seemed completely empty. The door had not been bolted, because it was barely hanging to the wall. It had clearly been smashed open, splitting the wood in many places and scattering splinters across the hall. That was not the only sign of a struggle. Bowls and plates were strewn across the floor. Cooked meats and hewn chunks of bread had spilled from them in every direction. Standing proud from a small wooden table is the haft of a large felling axe, its blade buried deep in the table's surface. There was a fight here, said Brankoff. Maybe the steak was just too tough, quipped de Ruinart instinctively. Brankoff looked back at him, unamused. There's not much blood, but the same fate that befell our captors may well have come for the people of this inn, said Brankoff. We should check upstairs to be sure, challenged Simmery. Someone could be hiding. They might know what happened. With a nod, Brankoff agreed, and then added, The barn needs checking too, but we shouldn't waste time here. It's a hunting ground now. I think you're right, Simmery said, as she edged around the bar to look into the small kitchen space behind it. Gillum was already in there looking at the cold ashes in the fireplace. Simmery continued, Brankoff, de Ruinart, you two check the barn. Me and Gillum can search the rest of the inn. Then we meet outside at the horses. The soldier and the mage agreed and turned to leave, Simmery's voice following them. Keep your eyes open, stay focused. There's something here that feels very dangerous. Gillum was lost in thought as he looked down at the kitchen workbench when Simmery spoke to him. Is there any food we can take? There were cuts of meat and prepared vegetables all over the countertop, carving knives, soup ladles, and meat forks lying chaotically amongst them. Open sacks of flour had spilled their contents onto the floor, and more bread was piled in a small basket on the side table next to the fireplace. It was all rotten. Dirt and soil covered every surface, and vines and leaves had burst in from the forest through damaged panels in the wooden walls. It was as if the place had been abandoned for a century and reclaimed by the woods. Simmery was shocked by what she saw. She had heard songs of the wood elves, and knew that they communed with the spites of the forests. This looked like their work, the magical hands of the woods reaching forth to destroy the intruding presence of man. But why? And why only in the kitchen and not the main hall? She regretted sending de Ruinart out to the barn now. If he really was a mage, then perhaps he could shed some light on what had happened here. Brankoff walked towards the barn doors slowly. Simmery was the only one of them to have found a sword at the wagon wreckage. The rest of the guards' weapons were nowhere to be seen. That was why the soldier had prized the axe from the table before they left the inn, replacing his chunk of wood. And it was why he held it ready as he approached the barn doors now. De Ruinart had come outside with him, but almost immediately, the mage had claimed he heard something and started making towards the tree line. Brankoff was not so foolish as to descend into that darkness without necessary cause, but despite his appeals to the mage's sense of reason, de Ruinart seemed oddly set on his decision. There was even a sudden hint of joyous enthusiasm in the man's voice. What it could have been that he thought he'd heard, Brankoff had no idea. It was still utterly silent. Only their own footsteps in the dirt created any distraction from the oppressive calm. With the mage making off into the woods, Brankoff considered going back in to find Simmery and Gillum, but then he thought better of it. The boy would be useless. The woman, at least, looked like she could handle herself in a fight, but if she cleared the inn, maybe found some supplies, and he cleared the barn, then they could make a move quickly. Maybe they should just ride on immediately, he thought, but the questions kept coming back to him. What had happened here? Who killed the guards that rode with them? How had they crashed in the first place? If there was something in this forest that was following them, then he had to know what it was. That was the only way he would know how to fight it. He raised the axe and sliced through the knot that held the barn doors closed. Slowly, they creaked open. De Ruinart could still make out the faint strings of the lyre, but it was the haunting voice that affected him most. Such a mellifluous tune. It reminded him of the song his nursemaid, Elis, sang when he was just a child. How could he hear it here, in these dark woods? Just ahead, he thought he saw something moving, a flash of white between the branches. Could it be Elis, all these years later? She was the only person who had cared about him when he was growing up, the only person he was sorry to leave behind. What was she doing here? He pressed on, into the darkness. Simmery and Gillum slowly walked up the creaking steps and onto the landing of the inn's first floor. The wind whistled through the smashed window at one end of the corridor, and a slim shaft of light came with it, illuminating the many doors along the walls. Simmery stepped forwards, listening intently for any other sound that might indicate someone else was there. Gillum stood behind her at the top of the stairs, clearly becoming agitated. He shivered nervously and was sniffing loudly. She knew she would have to calm him down, or else he might have a fit, or cause some other distraction at the worst possible moment. She cautiously crept forward and opened the first door, sword in one hand ready to strike if necessary. It was empty. As she began moving on to the next one to repeat the process, she asked Gillum, "Where are you from? I don't recognize your accent." Gillum coughed and seemed distant for a moment. "I was born in the wasteland, but raised in Marienburg." "I love Marienburg. It's not far from my home at all. We're practically neighbours, Gillum." "How did you come to be all the way out here in Ostland?" Simmery asked enthusiastically as she closed the door of the next empty room along. I was sold onto a merchant ship, crew for a trading vessel that moved lumber along the Reich. It was only recently that I was freed. I'd just been exploring the Empire, really," Gillum answered. The two of them stood together in front of the final untested door on the corridor. Simmery reached out her hand to turn the handle. A broken-down carriage sat on the floor of the barn, 4 cracked and shattered wheels leaning up against the ragged wooden frame of the vehicle. Brankov stepped inside the building, axe in hand. Rusty tools lay on a workbench to one side, spare parts and cut wood waited next to them. There seemed to be little else in the barn, though hidden at the back was another door, a small, ill-fitting panel held closed by a latch. The towering warrior walked towards it and slowly lifted the metal latchkey. He inched the door open and peered into the darkness beyond it. Once the door was fully open, he crouched through the short opening into the forest. Slivers of greenish light pierced through the trees, creating small wells of illumination along the pathway in front of Brankov. As he looked about the trees, he felt that something was wrong. Something was watching him. He was being hunted. He needed to get back through the barn door right now. He turned to step through it when he caught a movement right next to him in the corner of his eye. With honed instinct and perfect form, he rapidly twisted in place and brought the axe smoothly down exactly where the movement had been. It bit deep into the mud of the forest floor, in the center of a pool of light. It was his own shadow that he had seen as he moved through the sickly green sliver of Moor's light. He was about to breathe a sigh of relief, to laugh at his own stupidity, when he felt a sudden nick of pain across his cheek, then another on his hand. Then he felt 1,000 cuts across his skin, as thorny branches of the forest itself began whipping around him and slicing at his flesh. The great warrior brought down his axe quickly on the thickest vines and branches, but yet more snapped out at him. They twisted around his legs, holding him in place. They worked around his torso and entangled his arms so that he could no longer swing the axe. It fell to the ground with a thud, whilst he gave out an involuntary yelp of pain. The twisted branches pressed tight against him, the many thorns digging deep into his skin. The vines began to squeeze ever tighter. They did not stop. Another empty room. In one sense, Simmery was relieved. It meant that they could just leave this place and keep moving. But in another, it was frustrating beyond measure. It was clear that something was going on here, that something unnatural was at work in these woods, and that it had taken an interest in the 4 of them since the crash. "Let's head to the horses, meet up with the others," she said to Gillum before making for the stairs. Gillum slowly began to follow her. Whatever had done this, whatever had attacked the wagon, was it the same thing? Was it the reason it was so quiet in the forest? Why so little light seemed to reach them? Was it why it felt like days had passed rather than hours? Her thoughts were punctured by Gillum's voice. If Fuzel is right, and the white goat has killed all of these people, do you think it kills for a reason? Or just because it likes to kill? Stopping at the top of the stairs, the forthright warrior turned to Gillum and replied, "I don't know, Gillum. Why does anyone kill? I don't think I've ever met someone who did it just because they liked it." The boy looked at Simmery with a quizzical expression, one that she couldn't quite understand. With a blank, almost soulless voice, he said, "I think he likes it. The anticipation of the hunt, the thrill of the kill. I bet it feels like nothing else." There was something in the way Gillum spoke that sent a shiver along Simmery's spine, as if he wasn't just speaking about the white goat. She felt compelled to ask, "Gillum, why were you in the wagon with us? What crime had you committed that would see you sentenced to death?" For a moment, the boy said nothing. He just stared into Simmery's eyes. She felt something strange in her stomach, a pain like after the crash, but worse. She was confused. Gillum's features had contorted into a twisted visage of rage and hatred. Looking down at his hands, Simmery saw him pull a kitchen knife from the wound he had caused to her belly. A searing pain rolled through her, and her knees gave out simultaneously. She fell backwards, careening down the stairs with a succession of brutal thuds and cracks. The young man stepped over Simmery's body at the bottom of the stairs, the blood dripping from the knife he held in his hand, adding to the large pool that had already formed there. He walked out of the darkened inn, passing under a faded and peeled sign obscured by overgrown vines. Beneath the dim painting of an animal bounding over a great black rock read the words, "The White Goat." Gillum mounted his horse, having grabbed the reins of the others so that he might have spares in the morning. By the time the others realized what had happened, he would be long gone. It felt good to be free again, to be himself. His important work had been interrupted for too long, thanks to Drakberger and his men. Now Gillum could continue adding to his tally. With Simmery, that was 7. Just 2 more to go. It was not far down the road, when the horses began braying and moving erratically. Suddenly, the animal beneath him reared up, and Gillum was thrown from the saddle. He hit the ground with a smack, his head hammering into the hard earth. How many hours Gillum remained there he couldn't say, but when he awoke, his head was pulsing with pain, and his vision was blurry. The forest was still shrouded in inky blackness, and Gillum went to stand up, but he found that he couldn't. His hands were bound by thick, heavy vines. The only sound was of hoofsteps coming towards him from the direction of the inn, but he couldn't twist his head to see if it was one of the horses or something else. The crunch of the earth got closer. It circled around him in the darkness. Eventually, through his blurred vision, he was able to catch a glimpse of something, a huge shape cloaked in white. It stopped in front of him. All was calm and still for a moment, and then the white-hot pain began. Gillum screamed and screamed and screamed, until everything stopped. I hope that you enjoyed this year's Warhammer Ghost Story for Christmas. I enjoy writing these. I know they're silly little things, but I think it's fun. I think it's a neat tradition to tell ghost stories around this time of year. So I just wanted to share this little story with you. If you did enjoy it, there's a couple other similar videos from previous years. The Tallow Man and the Ochre Paddle, both are available on the channel. And if you really enjoyed it, or you like folk horror RPG stuff, then you can check out my Patreon, where I am giving away for free a little RPG scenario, a little module that ties directly into the White Goat story. That's available right now at patreon.com/JordanSorcery. Thank you very much for watching. Merry Christmas. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.